Okay. Neglected tropical diseases. How would you define them? Are you able to do you know what entities are, and would you able to cite one or more entities? I know you know one. Do you know some examples of the entities? No, don't be shy.
One Visceribus leniensis, it's also known as Galaza. It's mainly seen in the poorest of the poor people, and it's caused by sandflies. When they bite the humans, they transmit the disease. And so then the people present with something which is treatable, but it's very severe because then they have a splenomegaly and they have fever. But because it presents in very poor people, so the people might not present in the hospitals. So it's something that is seen in the tropics. It's something that's in poor people. So that's why it's under the neglected tropical.
I think that's a very nice way to you actually define what entities are. There are two crucial words. One is tropical, so it means that we are talking about a condition that is either exclusively or predominantly present in the tropics. And then you talk about another key word, which is poor, poverty. And whatever the definition you find on neglected tropical disease, whether it's the WHO definition or, for example, a definition that is given in it's an open access scientific journal that is entirely dedicated to neglected tropical diseases. They have also their own definition, but whatever definition you will find, you will always find this key word, which is poverty. But let's have neglected disease, a diverse group of communicable diseases. That's already debatable, because we will see, for example, in your group work, half of you will work on snake bites. Should snake bites be included in the list of entities? And of course, snake bite is not a communicable condition. Okay, they mainly affect people living in poverty without adequate sanitation, close contact with infectious vectors. The definition of the Journal Plus NTD, a group of poverty-promoting chronic infectious disease which primarily occur chronic. This is not always chronic. If you think that dengue fever, for example, is included in a group of NTDs, whether, even though it's debatable that it should be, in the area of low-income, middle-income countries, they are poverty-promoting because of their impact on child and development. That's interesting. It's not only due to poverty, but it also feeds and aggravates poverty, and we will see how. So these are definitions, and in fact, it's not so easy to find a very clear, standardized, and unique definition of NTDs. Even if you go either in the WHO documents, etc., this is something copied from their website. So even in the 2010 key WHO document, entities are not so properly defined, in fact. There are some common features. You see, gray is that it's a bit debatable, but it's a proxy for poverty disadvantage, okay? I think this is understood. It affects population with low visibility and little political voice. Very important, very crucial. And it's certainly one of the key factors why these diseases have been really forgotten for so long. They do not travel widely. So we will see later on with Eve that this is not entirely true for all neglected tropical disease. Some have really globalized. They cause stigma and discrimination, especially of girls and women. If we think of conditions like leprosy or cutaneous leishmaniasis, for example, that's clearly true. They have an important impact on morbidity and mortality. we have to say that the impact of on morbidity is really stronger, is more prominent and important than the impact on mortality, even though some of these diseases, they are fatal if left untreated. They are much less numerous in numbers than other diseases that are more associated with morbidity. They are relatively neglected by research, and they can be controlled, prevented, and possibly eliminated using effective and feasible solutions. I think it's also important, if you read, the literature on NTDs of a few years ago, they were separating two groups of NTDs, those who are called tools ready and those who are called tools deficient. And this is obsolete, because in fact, there are tools, even though sometimes the tools are not ideal, but there are tools for all of these diseases to control them, sometimes with an objective of elimination and even eradication, but this will be covered later on. So maybe these neglected tropical diseases, they are neglected because they are neglectable. Perhaps they don't deserve to be put forward. In fact, it's clear that if you compare to this is the overall burden of disease in terms of in dailies, disability adjusted life years. These are figures of 2010 and 12. And okay, HIV of course is very high, about 90 million babies. Malaria and tuberculosis, the big three as we call them. So of course, if you take neglected tropical disease individually, you see Chagas, dengue, echinococcus, foodborne dermatitis, African trypanosomiasis, etc. They don't weigh much in comparison to either of the big three. And this is the main reason why these diseases that are quite different one from each other, they have been grouped together into one entity that is called neglected tropical disease. Even though it's still smaller than the big three, it is really very significant in terms of overall public health burden. So the reason why NTDs are now have been grouped together is very important. Why is it important, in fact? Just to show on the slide, but why is it so important to show that it has an important public health burden?
Attention, motivation to spend money.
Absolutely. That's an advocacy tool to gather attention and also to gather funding. And we will have many opportunities to talk about that. Funding for research and development of better tools, but also funding for programs to be operational for controlling or eliminating NTDs. And we will see later on if this has worked or not.
But maybe you can just give an interesting point on why finally the burden is not that high. Because the way it's measured with DALYs is a kind of mismeasurement. Because as François said, most of them are not fatal disease. They are disabling disease. So in a way, they weight much less than fatal disease like HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. Nevertheless, in terms of numbers, we estimate that currently 1.2 billion people on Earth are affected by NTD, one or more NTD. So, depending on the focus you put on disease, the way you estimate the real burden is quite different. And we'll come back to that in terms of economic cost as well.
So, yes.
Dengue fever is considered tropical.
Excuse me?
Dengue.
Yeah, it is considered as a neglected tropical disease, at least by WHO. But this is indeed very debatable because there are now many, out of these common features. some are not true anymore for being efficient. But this is a very nice, it's a good point. We will go back to this list of this WHO list of neglected tropical disease. And I think one important point is that we hope that this list is not carved in a stone. I think it must be an evolving list, and actually there are now discussions that are ongoing. Last week there was a meeting here at WHO with the Scientific Technical Advisory Group of the Neglected Tropical Disease Department to review, in fact, this list of neglected tropical disease, perhaps to include others and perhaps to exclude some. So it should be, and I hope it will be in the years to come, a changing list, because there are quite a few conditions that are queuing to be part of this list.
And we'll discuss about that later a lot, about the politics of being in, being out.
Yeah, why is it so important to be in the list? So if you take, this is a little bit related to what the previous slide. If you take this, the source from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, you can pick up any country, and then you can see and compare the burden of disease, the comparison between 1990 and 2013. And in fact, when the diseases are taken individually, it's relatively rare that you see in the top 10 an NTD appearing. But this is the case in Sudan, for example, with leishmaniasis, which is a top 10 of years of life lost to premature death, which is due to mortality. This leishmaniasis, which is a very prominent disease in Sudan. And considering the years of life, healthy life lost due to disability, you will see schistosomiasis appearing. But it's almost an exception. If you pick up most of the other countries, you won't see appearing, single individual NTD as a top 10 cause of mortality or top 10 cause of morbidity. But if they were grouped together, I'm sure they would appear in most of these statistics. So the big question is, okay, neglected, easy to say, but finally, they are neglected by whom? Who neglect these diseases? And we will see that what we are going to list here is is becoming less and less true. This slide was absolutely true and spectacularly true 10 years ago. And it's becoming, years after years, it's becoming less and less, and we will see this evolution with Eve later on. But in your opinion, it's neglected by whom? Yes?
Yeah, I think it's, I can say it's neglected by pharmaceutical companies,
Yes.
like rare diseases.
Yes. Why is that?
Because normally such diseases happen in, let's say, in poor countries.
Yes.
So for them, not really interesting. So.
Yes, absolutely. So it's clear that the way pharmaceutical companies function is that, of course, they are driven by perspectives of profit, and neglected tropical diseases are not a profitable market, either because the diseases are not prominent enough in terms of numbers, but most importantly, because the people who are suffering from them do not have the financial capacity to, and neither the countries, to pay for the drugs. So that's a very, of course, crucial element. But are they the only one to point with a finger? Yeah.
The decision makers.
Decision maker, yeah.
Yes, excellent. Decision makers, both at international level and also at country level. For very long, there was really no interest also at the Ministry of Health level to have a budget line dedicated to these diseases. And it was, of course, related to all these things are very interlinked. There was no political benefit from anyone, for example, at the Parliament, to raise up the issue of neglected tropical disease. Because those who were affected, they live in the remote countryside, sometimes very far from the capital city. They have no political voice. So this is absolutely true. And as you will see, it is much less true now, but it was very true 10 years ago still. Others?
Quite a lot by research also, you have to say.
Yes, this is true.
By the media sometimes also by the media.
Excellent. I think you have listed them all. So the pharmas, also the producer of diagnostic tests, because drugs is one thing, but diagnostic tools are another. And we will see that many of these conditions we are lacking proper diagnostic tools. It's not only little research and development for new diagnostic tests, drugs or vaccine, but even it has been a fight to keep on the production of the few existing drugs for this disease. It's much less now, but it was a fight 15 years ago. The funders, both for research and development and control program. So, you know, there are no global fund for malaria, HIV, and TB for neglected tropical disease. No US President's initiative for malaria, as there was. And this neglect by public funders is more pronounced than philanthropic funders. In fact, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been a prominent funder of NTB program. But here also, we will see how it has evolved in the last 10 years, because it has evolved a lot. The national policymakers, as you rightly say, for the reason we already stated, the academic centers, both in endemic and in non-endemic countries, these are conditions and diseases that are poorly taught, poorly covered in the curriculum. For example, here at the Faculty of Medicine, only about 20% of students, they take an optional course on tropical diseases, and they have, you know, they acquire some basic knowledge on tropical medicine, including NTDs. There is, I think, in total, 4 hours that are given on emerging infections or tropical diseases here for our students. And then the insufficient advocacy and media coverage. But we will come back, of course, on all of these aspects. Is that true? So I will hide this part because it will be then covered. This just to express the relative lack of research for new drugs. Is the number of new clinical entities. It means new molecules that are put into the market. So you can see between 1975 and 1999, NTDs, there were only 9 drugs developed for the 17 neglected tropical diseases. In fact, in these statistics, it includes even more than the 17 from the WHO list. 4 for malaria, 3 for TB. In total, 16, so 1.1% for these all these conditions compared to the other diseases. So 1.1%, even though these diseases are responsible for 11 to 12% of global burden of disease worldwide. So these are very 2 important publications that you can easily find. I hide this part here is to show the evolution because Yves will talk about it later. There is a big advantage to group these diseases together we have seen for advocacy purpose and research for funding. But there is also a bit downside of it, is that these conditions, they are very different one from each other. And the mode of control of this disease, what has to be done to control them, is also very different. One way to control NTDs is a strategy called preventive chemotherapy. What does that mean? Do you know? Someone knows what it is? Yes?
For example, it's often done with school-aged children. So they give them preventive chemotherapy to prevent infection with, for example, soil transmitted parasites.
Absolutely. The strategy of preventive chemotherapy is a purely public health strategy, but it also sometimes benefits individuals. The objective is to decrease the infectious load within individuals and to break the transmission cycle from one individual to the other. There are two potential benefits. For soil-transmitted ailments, for example, children who carry a lot of ailments, they are the ones who are at risk of getting malnourished or having clinical consequences from their infection. If you have a few ailments, very few consequences. But if you have a lot of ailments, if the burden of ailments, of worms is high, then you have heavy consequences. So the objective of mass drug administration, given at school every 6 or 12 months, is to decrease the parasite burden, to decrease the parasite load so that the children do not suffer from infection. It does not aim at controlling infection. For this, you will need to have other strategies with, like the provision of safe water, sanitation, and hygiene that is linked with that. But for other diseases, like we will see an example with onchocerciasis, the objective of preventing chemotherapy is to break the transmission cycle. For example, for lymphatic filariasis also. So you don't cure the individual, but you destroy the larvae of worms, for example, that are responsible for transmission to another person, being picked up by a vector, for example, a fly or mosquito, etc., and that infect others. We will see examples today, and especially tomorrow, there will be a big focus on this group of entities that are controlled by preventive chemotherapy. The other big group are those who are controlled by innovative and intensified case management. What does that mean? It means that to reinforce the capacity to detect, diagnose, and treat individuals who are infected. We will see also a lot of examples. And then some disease can be controlled by vector ecology, in other words, by vector control, for example, insecticide spraying, etc. Provision of safe water, sanitation, and hygiene, and veterinary public health if there are zoonoses. What strikes you when you see this list? What big public health tool that we usually use to control disease is not present for NTDs? Vaccination, exactly. There is one exception though. Now there is a vaccine for dengue that starts to be implemented in some countries, but otherwise there are absolutely no existing vaccines for any of these conditions. So this is this famous list of 17 entities, included in this is the WHO list. So you will have time to discover them, but let me give you a quick panorama of these, of some of these 17 entities. First one is Buruli ulcer. It's a bacteria, it's a mycobacteria like tuberculosis, but it's a different kind of mycobacteria. that the transmission to individuals is not very clear, but clearly it's related to contact with water, with rivers, and etc. And it's a skin infection that produces ulcers that can be very large from time and sometimes infect the underlying bones. It's prominently present in Africa, but you also have bowling ulcer in some areas in South America and even in the northern Australia. Even if it heals, it leaves very handicapping scars that has very important functional consequences. You see that's a relatively small number of cases, mainly once again present in Western and Central Africa. Chagas disease, that will be, we will see a movie on that disease later on. It's a disease that is mainly present in Latin America. It's transmitted by, it's a parasitic disease. Here is the Trypanosoma cruzi. It's a one-cell parasite, so it's a protozoa, which is a definition of one-cell parasite. That is transmitted by red-leaf bugs, Triatoma. Typically, in this type of conditions, people are bitten at night when they sleep in this kind of simple housing. Sometimes it makes an acute disease, but most of the time, 20 or 30% of patients after 20 or 30 years, they develop a cardiac condition with arrhythmias and sudden death and cardiac insufficiency. It's one of the main causes of cardiac failure and arrhythmia in Latin America, or also some digestive problem, the esophagus or the large bowel. So people have problems to swallow and they are severely constipated. We will come back, of course, to Chagas in the movie later on. And also it will be covered by Yves to show this is an example of a globalized neglected tropical diseases. Dengue and chikungunya, okay, it affects a much higher number of people. These are arboviruses. There is a third one now that has been really very prominent in the last year, which is Zika. They are all transmitted by these mosquito belonging to the Aedes family, Aedes aegypti. These mosquitoes, they adapt very well to urban life and suburban life. They can develop everywhere, like in these old tires. And it's an acute disease, a few days of fever that ends up with a rash, like in this patient. And sometimes it's complicated for dengue by hemorrhage and shock and sometimes death. Completely different as a disease, dracunculosis or Guinea worm. You can see it may be the number 2 eradicated disease after what's the first disease that has been eradicated on this planet?
Smallpox.
Smallpox, yeah. And perhaps this will be number 2, Guinea worm. You see, number of cases recorded in 2014, 22, up to now in until mid-2015 there were 5. Let's see the stats. This is controlled, it's not controlled by drugs or anything, it's just a disease that there is a very long worm that emerges on the skin here, it's very painful, and the larvae are in the water if people bath, in fact, in the water, so the water is contaminated. The larvae infect these cyclops, it's like a zooplankton, and people get infected when they swallow water contaminated by these zooplankton. In fact, the preventing measures are very simple. People who have these ulcers should not go in the water, and people who drink the water should just drink after the water is filtered through a simple cloth, like a sarong or any kind of cloth. It's sufficient. doesn't need, sophisticated filters. Human African trypanosomiasis, I will in fact skip this slide because this will be a case study we will study tomorrow morning, really in detail, transmitted by tsetse flies in Central and West and a little bit East Africa. Leishmaniasis, Kanika, your colleague told about visceral leishmaniasis, which is the severe form, disseminated form of leishmaniasis, which is a small parasite, protozoa that infects macrophages, the cells that are important for immune defense. So it can affect the overall body or the mucosa or the skin in the cutaneous leishmaniasis form. And it's all transmitted by these small flies called sandflies. Leprosy, that you certainly know, it's also a mycobacterium, a bacteria that infects the skin and the nerves and destroy the nerves, and people end up with very severe skin ulcers, like diabetic patients. They don't feel anymore when they walk. If the shoe is not well adapted, it creates ulcers that end up destroying limbs, and also the skin condition. So it's primarily an immune and neurological disorder, more importantly than being an infectious and skin disorder. Onchocerciasis, it's a disease transmitted by this little fly here, called a simili. That doesn't sound very English, simili. Black flies, yes. Black flies. So it's prominently present in Western and Central Africa. There are a few spots in Latin America that have been, in fact, due to the slave trade until the middle 19th century. So it seeded in some Latin American countries, but it's almost eliminated in these countries. The black fly inject a small larva that will develop in an adult under the skin. They live in nodules, just under the skin, on top of bones, prominence. The adults mate, and actually the larvae circulate in the skin and in the eyes. It makes very severe itching and chronic skin lesions. But the most important thing is that these larvae that are produced by the adults, they circulate in the eye, and they finally induce an inflammatory response that destroys the cornea and other parts of the eye and leads to blindness. So this is an example where control is based on preventive chemotherapy. 30 years ago, control of onchocerciasis was based on destroying the larva of the larva of the fly by spraying insecticides on the rivers, because these flies, the larvae develop on running water on the riverside. But of course, ecologically and also the cost of these type of activities was very high, and it was replaced by another approach, which is preventive chemotherapy. It's regular distribution of ivermectin, which is an antiparasitic drug that is donated by the pharmaceutical company, Merck. And what is the objective is to destroy the microphylla, the larva of the parasite. So two consequences. First, the pathology of in humans is due to the circulating larva, so it prevents the skin lesions, and it also prevents people getting blind. And the second consequences is that it help to control the disease, because if you destroy the larva circulating in the patient's skin, then the fly that bites this patient does not infect itself anymore and cannot infect another person. So you see, there is a benefit here for the patient, for the individual, but there is also a benefit in terms of public health by breaking the transmission. So that's a really interesting type of preventive chemotherapy that has this double action. Lymphatic filariasis, it's a parasite that is transmitted by mosquitoes, and the adult lives in the lymphatic vessels, especially at the roots of limbs, like legs or here at the roots of arms. And it actually creates a dysfunction of this lymphatic system. And because the lymph cannot cannot be evacuated anymore, is blocked downstream, it accumulates and it creates edema. This edema at the start is reversible, but after a while it is not reversible anymore. The skin cannot defend itself, it gets infected, it gets inflamed chronically, it gets thickened, and you have all seen these pictures in textbook of elephantiasis. That is the ultimate stage of lymphatic filariasis. So here we have once again a very disabling condition associated with high morbidity, but very little mortality. And the control is also based on preventive chemotherapy. The objective here is to destroy the circulating larva in the blood so that a mosquito that bites cannot be infected anymore and doesn't infect another person. This is an example of preventive chemotherapy that is beneficial in terms of public health, but not for the patient, because the patient suffers from the adult worms that are in the lymphatic systems, responsible for and the drug that is being given, ivermectin, kills the microfilaria that are not responsible for the pathology of the patient, of the clinical signs. So here we have a preventive chemotherapy that is purely for public health purpose, to control the disease and to eliminate the disease. It has no benefit for the patient. But it's linked to morbidity management and disability prevention. That's what is lymphatic filariasis control based on. I'm just continuing and finishing this list. The soil transmitted helminths, we briefly talked about it. There are many, of course. The three main ones are ascariasis, trichuliasis, the whipworm, and hookworms. They are responsible when they are present in large quantities for malnutrition. You can imagine that all these worms, they consume everything you eat. They are also responsible for microbleeding that is repeated every day. You lose some blood because both this one and hookworms, they feed on the mucosa. They are responsible for small blood loss. But if there are many parasites, this addition of small blood losses makes consequent blood losses and deficit in iron and iron deficient anemia. So it's a very prominent cause of anemia in the tropics. Schistosomiasis, a very important neglected tropical disease. This is a worm that is acquired when you swim or you work in rivers or lakes, in freshwater lakes or rivers. The larva goes through the skin, it migrates in the body, and then the adults end up living in the veins that surrounds the intestine or surrounds the urogenital tract. And these worms, they are not responsible for any symptoms. In fact, they live quietly for up to 20 years. The female and the male together, it's almost a very romantic love story. The problem goes is that as they are always together, The female lay a lot of eggs and daily, and these eggs they go through and they are through the bladder wall and they are spread in the urine, or they go through the intestinal wall and they are spread in the stools, and they complete the cycle. But the problem is that many of these eggs cannot make it through. They stay, they die in the walls of the bladder or in the walls of the barrel. They create chronic inflammation, and also the eggs can be taken into the veins and end up in the liver, where they produce chronic inflammation and cirrhosis, and what we call portal hypertension, varicose bleeding, and people vomit blood and die from vomiting blood. So this is a very important and severe condition mostly in Africa, but I'm sure that it will be covered tomorrow by our colleagues. And finally, almost finally, trachoma. It's due to Chlamydia trachomatis. It's a disease it's a bacteria that affects the eye, the eyelids, but also the cornea, and also leads to blindness. It's very related to deficit in hygiene, lack of water. It's transmitted by these flies. That it's not an active transmission. The flies have on their legs, in fact, they carry the bacteria from one person to another. And it's also controlled by mass drug administration of azithromycin, an antibiotic, together with hygiene measures, provision of safe water, etc. And finally, it will be half of you are going to work on that disease, Yos, or endemic trypanomatosis. It's also a skin infection that can also infect the bones, the underlying bones, that is transmitted directly from one person to another, that is due to a trypanoma, like syphilis. It's a bacteria, and it's mostly prominent in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and New Guinea, and in West Africa. This is a disease that is due to be eradicated, even though that its talk has been there for quite a long time. But if you will have the opportunity to work on that disease, and Eve will cover that later. So this is it for this panorama. And of course, I know that it's impossible to retain all this information, but the idea is to give you this overall picture of these very different diseases. They have these common features of being associated with remote tropics and poverty, but as you can see, the clinical consequences are very variable, and also the mode of control is very variable. Any burning question?
Okay, so let's change discussion from the disease to the field of NTD. My aim now for this short session is to discuss with you about more or less the emergence of that field as a field, because 20 years ago nobody talked about NTDs. So how did it become an issue? Who framed that issue, and why is it framed like that? So basically these are very old diseases. You have left Incas mummies from Peru, in the remains of which we found DNA from Trypanosoma cruzi, the agent of Chagas disease. And to the right, the grave of Richard III, the famous English king, which actually the soil around the cadaver was full of eggs of soil element. So you can see that not only in the tropics, but also in England, and even rich kings were affected by NTDs. And actually, the interest from the Western world point of view probably started with the colonial history. And when we sent armies and troops to the developing world, or to the tropics at that time, actually one of the key issues for the metropolis was to maintain the health of the soldiers and the traders and the churchmen that were sent to colonize this kind of exotic land. And at first, these diseases were really tainted with exotism. It was disease from far away, disease from the tropics, and it was actually the cradle for the development of tropical medicine. And you know that in Europe and in the Northern Hemisphere, several cities became very famous for the tropical disease center, and these were more or less the same cities or regions where usually the ships would go to Africa or Asia or Latin America, such as Liverpool or London, whatever. So the issue was about security of the colonial force, and at the same time, it was also tainted with an experimental field opportunity. So colonial forces would use, in a way, the tropics to develop the experimental way. Medicine is now practiced, or science, biomedical science is practiced. So there were experiments, and there were very famous ones, such as, for example, experiments regarding African trypanosomiasis, and François will talk more about that tomorrow, with spectacular results when the Belgian forces, for example, were in Congo. They implemented large-scale control measures and whatever, and we'll go through that tomorrow. So there is a clear connection between colonial history and the way we get interested in these infections. But most recently, this disease slowly emerged on the global health agenda. And if you look at the way they were framed or they were talked about, it's very interesting, because when WHO was created in 1948 or 1947, sorry, at first, up to and WHO engaged in classifying disease for epidemiological purpose. Actually, they were grouped into this very vague denomination called other disease, other communicable disease. So they were not properly identified, but they were already within a big, large group of disease that were left apart, but at least they were all together. And it was only in 1990, for the 10th revision of disease classification, that they became even more precisely denominated infectious and parasitic diseases. So you see, through the age, we come close to NTDs. And actually, during the last years of the 20th century, Médecins Sans Frontières started to promote and advocate for more attention on that group of disease, and they talk about neglect. And neglect was the key word that really changed the way, the perspective we looked at this disease, because neglect entails a kind of moral issue. If it's neglected, we have to do something about that neglect, and we'll come back to that later. So, early 2000, WHO catch the train and start to give more attention to this disease of poverty, and they start conducting expert meetings one after the other until 2006, when finally the issue was well framed enough to actually start an activity, a specific activity dedicated to that disease group. So until 2006, at WHO level, there were no specific NTD program as a whole. There were individual programs, but not as a whole. So in 2006, there is the Department of Control of NTD, which is created just next door from here, and we'll have Jean Janin just in an hour or so, who was actually the coordinator of that group, who will give a talk. And interestingly, institutions get hold of that topic, but also there is a need to promote research and diffusion, dissemination of knowledge. So a major biomedical publisher called PLOS, Public Library of Science from the US, creates a new open access journal, PLOS NTD, which has become the voice in the scientific community for biomedical research. So, and when you look at the entries on Medlines, that's the main search engine for biomedical research, you see the surge of number of articles being released every year since 2007 or 8. So actually the issue about this framing of NTDs is the need to create this critical mass, epidemiological critical mass, to highlight the burdens and to highlight also the needs related to that group of disease. And there were a lot of debates about how to limit a list of disease and where to put the boundaries, because you can imagine that each specialist was willing to have its disease, or each group of people were willing. So there were intense debates, and there were actually many different lists of disease created. So, for example, here is the PLOS NTD list, which includes probably 40 different diseases as compared to the 17 WHO. And actually, the way you enlarge or reduce the cursor means that in terms of epidemiology, you really talk about different needs and different burdens. So it's highly debatable why WHO has only selected 17. And there are very intense debates now by pressure groups. Would it be NGOs, would it be countries, that really stress the fact that it's unfair in a way to exclude some disease, because by being excluded from the WHO list, you get much less attention, but even more, so much less funds from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and all the big donors. So it's crucial to be part of that list, and it's highly political, the way this list has been framed, and we'll discuss more about that a little bit later. But keep in mind that NTD is a flexible concept in terms of the area it covers, and it's about to change probably in the next few years. So when WHO... Yes.
Certainly a question to ask the speaker, Jean Janin from WHO, about what criteria are used by WHO to be part of this WHO list. And we know some, but let's see what he will answer.
Yeah. So you have to challenge it. So, as I mentioned, WHO was created just after the end of World War II. And actually, since the first World Health Assemblies, you know, these annual assemblies that takes place in springtime, since the very first ones, resolutions have been taken and voted, resolution about some of the entities that are currently considered now. Like, for example, in 1948, first WHA assembly, vector-borne disease, then trypanosomiase, leprosy, rabies. So you see that from the beginning, countries were trying to push at the global stage level to have their country recognized as a global health issue. And actually, it's very interesting to see that it's quite effective at first. So you have this resolution that have been voted from the very early years. And actually, not only resolution, but also programs. Since the late 40s, some mass treatment programs are beginning to be implemented, including for yours, for example. And in 76, the first infectious disease is fully eradicated, smallpox, after a massive campaign over the world. And some countries take the lead, like China, taking very large-scale public health measure to control, for example, lymphatic filariasis by adding drugs into the salt, the salt that we use every day for cooking, and also doing vector control for schisto, doing health education for the people. So you see the beginning and the experimentation of this very large-scale program that will be replicated at an even larger scale later. For example, in Latin America, neighboring country from the south, central Latin America, gather to develop vector control program, because they soon realized that individual vector control program were not efficient, because mosquito or triatomine, they do not respect borders. So if you stop spraying here, the vector from just next door would come. And it's a very interesting point, because it's also related to the construction of national entities at that time, where there is a common sense of belonging to a new destiny after World War II and the independence movement. So they want countries were willing to free themselves from disease of poverty, so they gathered together and they developed common plans, and it was really effective at that time. And in the 90s, a major actor entered the field, because all these programs were limited by resource, and actually up to the 80s, countries were understanding that they couldn't really achieve their goal because of lack of resource, and notably because of lack of access to medicine. And that's a key issue that some big pharma decided at that time to start massive drug donation that really changed the rule of the game, because Ministry of Health and countries couldn't afford on a sustainable way to pay for drugs. So Merck, Pfizer started to make donation year after year, and that really enhanced the effectivity of a program. But up to the late 90s, the problem was that it was mostly a silo approach. So it was a very vertical, top-down approach, focusing one disease after another. There was very few interconnection, so requiring a lot of resource to be used for a single disease target, high cost, and not very sustainable, of course. So what happened after, I would say, the post-Cold War New Order? Actually, it changed a lot. Globalization of trade and finance changed the rule of the game for the pharmaceutical company. There were the emergence of the bio-threat issue, anthrax, HIV, Ebola, influenza were seen, suddenly infectious disease were seen as threat for the global order, and mostly for the northern countries. So a lot of resource was put into securitization, including bioterrorism and biological agents control. And some of infectious disease were framed as a global threat. And again, it was a key moment for entities because these diseases were not framed as global threat. So they were again put a little bit under the carpet and forgotten in respect to the attention that was given to HIV, influenza, or the virus infections. And the 90s were a very interesting decade where there was this global new order being put in place, and there was this issue of security, this issue of global trades, and new rules for intellectual property that meant that drugs became valuable assets, and markets were open for medicine, and obviously drugs for neglected tropical disease become very unattractive. So at that time there was this issue of complete lack of commercial incentive for pharmaceutical companies in a time where you could sell your new drugs for, let's say, HIV. You remember the price of the first antiretroviral, $30,000 a year. So why should company bother producing antibiotics that they sell 2 cents per tablet? So it was a turning point at that time. And actually, many people talk about this 10-90 gap, which relates to what François showed you, where investment in research and development from companies, pharmaceutical companies, for drugs that affected the world's poor were only around 10%, whereas this global population burden of disease was 90% of the global burden of disease overall in the world. So there was this clear issue of market failure. The market was not responding to the world's needs. And at the same time, there was a second trend, which was the rise of humanitarian medicine. And you remember that MSF got awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1999 as a recognition of this push towards, I would say, a contradictory approach to this post-Cold War New Order, where there was a focus on this so-called bottom billion population. It was not only about security for the North, development of free trade, development of a multinational and large-scale market, but there was a real concern for also the left apart population. And health was promoted as a core human right, whereas before it was not framed so much like that. And there was this idea of promoting development, sustainable development, or equitable development, and health was very much related to the development issue. We'll come to that later on. And at the WHO level, interestingly, you remember that the year 2000 were the year of the social determinant of health, which means that health was not only an individual issue, it was not only related to individual behavior, but it was much more of a political creation. Health is a political product of how societies are organized, how wealth is shared, how resources are accessible to all, how opportunities are provided to the whole population or country. And this rise of the social determinant opened up the field, in my idea, of the discussion for entities, because entities were framed as disease of poverty. They are not disease of poor people, but they are disease of poverty. So it's a wider approach. And in the late 90s, the global health panorama changed, where actually WHO was much less preeminent on the global stage. There were new new actors like the World Bank, for example, took a large importance. Large NGO were also taking more place, but WHO was very poorly funded in the late 90s, so it had to reduce its program and the scope of program very much. And that was the time when, through HIV, UNAIDS, the global funds, like non-institutional actors started to take the forefront seats. So many people started to push, including NGOs obviously, but not only, for a new orientation of the markets, like the market should respond to the bottom billion needs, and also for political refocusing on the poor's needs. So when at the turn of the millennium, the UN Assembly decided to agree on a set of core values for the 21st century, and the Millennium Assembly took place, they developed this pro-poor agenda, which is called the Millennium Development Goals. And the frame of these MDGs were that there was a bi-directional relationship between health, development, and security. You couldn't address development and security without considering health, because health was one of the drivers of development, and health issues were one of the key elements for global security. And that was very much so with framed with AIDS, which was killing billions of young people in southern African countries. So the productive part of the population was killed. So the economic collapse, turning into civilian arrests, disruption of violence, and global insecurity. So by having the health focus meant that it's really raised the importance of global disease, and that's exactly what happened with NTDs, because on MDG number 6, which is to combat, to fight against HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other disease, suddenly the other disease issue become the point of entry of NTD on the global stage. So even though MDGs were mostly addressing the big three, there were room for NTDs under this other disease, which was deliberately left vague, but you will see that many people engage in that opinion. So the year 2000 saw the rise of the NTD framing at the global stage by the emergence also of new big guns on the stage. So obviously the Bill and Melinda Gates played a prominent role at that time, but also the MDGs gave credit to WHO again. And actually it's very interesting how WHO benefited from these MDGs to come back to the world stage as, I would say, the driver of this renewed interest in health as a component of the world's development and security trends. And the year 2000 saw a massive flow of money into these MDGs focused disease, such as obviously malaria, HIV, and TB, but also for other diseases. We'll see that now. And the drug donations program really increased very, very importantly. One of the key development of that period were new models for market development for drugs, because as we have seen in the 90s, there was this market failure where lack of incentive for pharma company meant that you couldn't count on big pharma to develop research. So we had to find out new ways to create incentive, and actually it took the form of of new partnership, private-public partnership, and focusing on product development partnership, which means that you would bring together many stakeholders, funders, academics, pharma company, research institutes, and you would put research together to develop new drugs. And actually, the result was rather promising increase in the number of new drugs addressing NTD issues. François told you that before 2000, only 1% of drugs. After between 2000 and 2010, it rose to 4%. It's not much, but it's better than nothing.
Perhaps we can precise that here we are talking about new treatments, not new chemical entities, because it takes very long, of course, to develop a very new molecule in the market for NTDs. But what PDPs have done, they have focused their attention first on what they called low-hanging fruits. So instead of developing a new molecule from A to Z, they took existing molecules that were used for other indications, or they developed combination treatments from existing molecules, and they put them together. We will see examples later on, so that they could get early wins. So in fact, it's 4% of new treatments, but during that period, it's still 0 new clinical entity for NTDs.
Okay. So it's mostly new formulation of new indication of pre-existing drugs. But at least,
But it's fine. Why not?
Yeah.
It's much cheaper that way.
Yeah. So as I said, WHO regained its forefront seats on the global stage, but now many voices were asking, why only addressing these 17 diseases, not others? And are they all really neglected? For example, dengue. Dengue was getting a lot of attention due to this securitization issue I talked about before, because it was seen as a potential global threat, bio-threat for the world. So the US were putting hundreds of millions of dollars to get the vaccine, and they got it actually very, very quickly. So there was this issue. But WHO really gained, I guess, legitimacy and leadership through this NTD emergence. But it was also mutually interesting for NTDs, because through WHO, all these diseases got a say in the World Health Assembly and whatever. So it was, I think, a good win-win strategy. And WHO positioned itself more as an expertise provider rather than as it did in the 60s and 70s as the one who actually implemented the strategy. So the WHO role shifted, and it became also very clear that there was an issue about epidemiological data. Because for advocacy reason, numbers about the real burden and figure about the burden of disease were highly debatable, and WHO was willing also to kind of improve the quality of data, because there were so much energy lost into fighting about what is the most or the most important disease in regards to the others. So they really pushed for the development of much better surveillance and monitoring tools, and I think that's a great asset for today's discussion. And finally, WHO, through a set of papers, gather specialists and stakeholders and define a set of objectives for 2020. And this set of objectives are again very political, because most of them, in my opinion, and we'll discuss that, but most of them are more wishful thinking than real life objectives. But they have this essential quality of existing and putting a kind of roadmap ahead of us so that it's channel effort and resource to a common goal. And you can see here that some diseases are meant to be eradicated. We talk about Guinea worm actually in the very next few years, or globally eliminated by 2020, and it's very optimistic, obviously, but at least it brings together the stakeholders and push forward to achieve very ambitious goals. And I suggest that we challenge Dr. Janot later on about how these objectives were designed, chosen, how they were discussed, and what do they really mean. Because, because there are much debate about that. Okay, yet, despite all these efforts, there were still a lot of inequities in diseases that were actually receiving money and attention. And if on the left panel you see actually who was giving the money, or what was the source of funding for these very ambitious goals. So you see that the Gates Foundation was far ahead, and then there were a few development agencies, national development agencies, and finally you see that also the big three were still the one who received the money. So HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria far ahead the other one. But again, by grouping the 17 entities, if you add all the money channeled to the 17, it makes quite an interesting amount of money. So, as there was still this inequity between the objective and the fund available, the big guns gathered in London in 2012 to create this London Declaration to combat NTDs in order to raise the visibility of this disease and to gather even more money. So they actually could gather more than $700 million of funds to be committed for the 2020 objective. And actually, at the same time, Barack Obama in the US and the UK aid program add extra money to that commitment, and it really gave a momentum for NTDs in London at that time, that suddenly attracted the world attention, huge sum of money, very ambitious goals, so that was the moment to act. And actually, again, the money was channeled on a very quick win strategy that trying to push for treatment access, push for reducing the number of affected people, and actually there were again some discussion about where should the priority be set, and some diseases were completely excluded from the program design in London. For example, rabies or dengue. Dengue, it's not a problem, but cysticercosis or other. So there were really this problem of inequity between disease and some disease getting more attraction. So today, 3 or 4 years later, what we can see is that the drug donation program really increased very fast in the recent years, with some diseases being much more covered than others. Now, countries have implemented national plan to combat NTDs, and it's called country stewardship into the response to NTD. Money has been spent, but there is now an emerging issue about the gap between the money which has been offered and actually the money that has been given. So it seems that this gap is quite wide and widening. So there are issues about, is the money really here or not? And that might be one of the bottleneck for the next few years. Okay, so in conclusion, NTDs are not new. They are actually very old disease of poverty, but we are currently in the phase of an unprecedented momentum to attract attention and improve the global situation. Not all the diseases receive the same attention and are at the same stage of control. And actually, we are actually witnessing the WHO legitimacy being regained, and I think that's a very good, it's a good fact, because we need a global leader, and that we lost at the end of the 20th century. So there are many questions open, and we'll have time for discussion later on, but let me give you the opportunity to react or to discuss this very brief overview of anti-inflation. Is there any hot issue to be? Yeah.
I'm not a medical doctor, so my question may be very naive, but why do we speak about neglected tropical diseases and not only of tropical diseases? Why is it only communicable disease and not other kinds of diseases?
Yeah, that's a great point, and probably Jean-Jean will be the good person to ask, but definitely, in a way, there is the feeling that you can act efficiently and quickly on communicable disease. So even though there are many other diseases of poverty and non-communicable disease are preeminent in that field, by selecting the communicable disease, you can use common tools with a measurable impact on the short term, and you can measure your impact globally on a similar way. So I guess WHO had always had a focus on communicable disease since 1948, as we saw. So they decided to separate communicable from non-communicable disease for, I guess, strategic purpose, because they could implement specific tools. But that's a limitation, because for me, addressing NTD only with drugs and chemotherapy, it's not enough, because there are roots in a context of poverty, health service deficiency, and so on, that need to be addressed. And that's one of the key questions about, shall we have a biomedical approach to that disease, or shall we have a development approach to that group of disease? So we'll discuss that tomorrow with two key speakers, one of each defending one position, and I think that's a great question. Yeah.
We will hear also on Friday the man behind you, David Berra. He will also present you how to get out of these silos of NTD being taken care of as a single entity. How, because they share determinants for sure with non-communicable diseases like diabetes and others. So how can we find synergies between the control of NTDs and control of NCDs, or control of other infectious disease? For the first part of your question, why not tropical disease alone, is that the main one, malaria, was already benefiting from a large public source of funding. So that's one of the reasons why, in comparison to malaria, and to some extent HIV and tuberculosis, even though they are not tropical disease, they were mainly present in the tropics. they group these conditions together.
Any other
No,
questions?
no, please.
I have another question, but I don't want to monopolize the floor. It's about the fact that in the paper we had to read the WHO plan of 2003 or 5, I don't remember. It was said that we have to tackle those diseases in a comprehensive manner, so we don't create silos. But we saw with the Ebola epidemics recently that one of the problems created by the way we tackle health problems was to create silos for HIV, tuberculosis and malaria. So how is it possible that the same institution can have two totally different approach trying to tackle the health problem, which is
I think I would keep that question for Jean Chalmin. It's probably someone from WHO who should respond. In this kind of global documents, you have to distinguish what the readers would be pleased to read, and what is the real, what is in truth implemented. Of course, everyone wants to have an integrated approach, etc. But the problem is that most of the time, the funders themselves, they really want quick results on specific topics. And this is these 2020 objectives that have been designed by WHO for all these diseases. It's a double sword also, because it pleases a lot the donors, because there is a clear objective to reach, and they want to play a key role in funding programs to reach these objectives. It's very good for their visibility also as donors, etc. But the danger is that in itself it can reinforce silos and single disease approach, etc. So there is always pros and cons. But overall, I would say it's very spectacular, since the London Declaration and all these stakeholders, big pharmas, bilateral donors, philanthropic donors, they went together. In fact, they were already active before, but at least here there is a kind of a shell that grouped them together. But they are not the only one. Even the G7, the most industrial countries, last year in Germany in May, Angela Merkel, she pointed out 3 big health priorities. One is the lessons post-Ebola, one is antimicrobial resistance, and the other one is NTDs. And that's very important, it's just political talk. But then the bilateral agencies, they can rely on declaration of their own country at the G7. They say, okay, as was declared the G7 2015 declaration, then we can increase our bilateral aid based on these things for NTDs. So, but this is also interesting to see this London Declaration and all this group of stakeholders. They produce a very nice report and very interesting. You have to read it with a critical eye, I must say. But still, but they have created some tensions also, because as we are heading now to control or elimination or eradication objectives, the obsession now is field implementation and scaling up control measures. And research and development is a bit left apart. In fact, the DNDi, which is part of the London Declaration as one of the stakeholders, is not welcomed at all in the discussion, because these people, they don't want the money to be channeled to research and development. They really want the money to keep being channeled into control operations. But at least now there is much more attention and funding available. It's very spectacular, the evolution in the last 10 years.
Okay, I think we have to make a choice because we are very
I think
behind.
I would go for the movie.
Yeah,
Yes,
and so we skip that. Because we have 15 minutes left.
maybe we can have it at the end of the... I would go for the movie because it's
Yeah.
also
But so we'll encroach on the break.
a little bit. You can start 5 minutes late or so.
So I'd like to introduce the movie.
Yeah, this is a movie that it's a movie on Chagas disease. I think it's a movie that illustrates very well the neglect in the large sense of the term of one of these entities. We are in Argentina, which is not the least developed country. It's a middle-income country, very nicely developed. If you are in Buenos Aires, you think you are in Europe. But here we are in the Chaco area, northwest Argentina. And you will see all these determinants of neglect of Chagas. It's made by Ricardo Preve, which is a very known Argentinian movie maker and documentary maker. So let's see it and then a few reactions from your side.
You see well?
Yeah.